So this week's Parshas Lech Lecha, begins with the first godly appearance to Abraham. I should say to Avram, that's how he's originally called, who's later would become known as Abraham. What does God tell him? Go from your land, go from your birthplace, go from your father's home, and go to the land Asher Echo that I will show you, which was the land of Canaan. And he took his wife, whose name at that point was Sarai, who later would become known as Sarah. He goes to the land of Canaan, he builds an altar to God, and begins to spread the message of monotheism to his surrounding environment. What happens then? It's one of the tests of Abraham, and God brings a famine to the land of Canaan. So he is forced to go to Egypt. Why is it a test? Because immediately upon coming to a land that God himself is telling you to go, all of a sudden now you're being forced to leave. Now, Canaan at that time, why did it have food where everybody else didn't? Well, the Nile kept Egypt fertile. And it was a civilized place. They were developed. But on the other hand, they had moral depravity. They were known to be a depraved country, especially when it came to the area of sexual deviance. I don't know, something like that. Now, considering the dangers that Egypt presented to Abraham and Sarah, Avram begins to realize, or Avram to Sarai begins to realize that her beauty, while it may be an advantage in a beauty pageant, is going to be a disadvantage to her in Egypt. So what does the Torah tell us? That Avram tells Sarai that it will come to pass when the Egyptians will see you, they'll say, "Oi, it's his wife. What stops us from taking a wife? A husband. So we'll kill this guy and take her, bring her to the king." So he says to his wife, "Do me a favor. Tell them you're my sister, that we don't have a connection. So if they take you, they won't have a need to kill me." Okay. You know, that's, in a sense, pretty bad. But he adds this caveat. Torah tells us, "L'man yitav li v'avorech." Tell them you're my sister so that it will go well with me. And also that I will live. Because if you're my sister, the right thing to do is, if we're going to take your sister, we might as well appease you with gifts. Now, this seems pretty outrageous for a guy that's just had a conversation with God, that he would stoop so low to tell his wife, "Listen, hey, you know, the outcome may be inevitable, but at least make it worth my while." Is this the Avram that we know? Now, just to let you in, that there were many sages that also understood that this story needs a lot of explaining, especially the Barbanel, who Don Yitzchak Barbanel, who was expelled with the Jews from Spain in 1492, a great sage, the finance minister of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. He writes a language that's actually very strong. He says, "Umiya isha maila sheyivcha b'chayim." Who's that? What upstanding man chooses to live with such extreme disgrace, to ask his wife to debase herself so he can benefit? Better to choose death to avoid such depravity. Now, of course, Abarbanel knows who Avram is, and he's using the strength of his question to prove that there has to be some type of answer But from the question itself, we understand that it would be outrageous to think that Avram would put his wife at risk and he should benefit. Now, we know that Avram and Sarah had no choice but to go down to Egypt. It was the only country with food. The question becomes is, knowing what Egypt is all about, what course of action do we take? Avram thought, look, there's no doubt that if they find that I am a deterrent to taking you, they're going to kill me. So at least get me to live. That part maybe we can come to terms with. But that little nuance of let it be good for me is, listen, if I'm going to live already and your end is already decided, let it at least be profitable. So there are many, many approaches to this story. One is a very practical by the famous Gaon of Rogachev, who says that Avram was basically instructing Sarai, almost in code, tell them you're my sister. Become my sister. You're no longer my wife. Become a free agent. I want you to give up being married to me, and that's it. Whatever. And so on and so on and so on. I am going to offer you an approach by the Zohar, the book of mysticism, to understand this story both on a practical level, but really to understand that this story is almost functioning solely at a spiritual state. We're going to start off with the statement of the Zohar. The Zohar tells us that Avram was certain that no harm would befall his wife. How did he know this? He knew that all the Egyptians were sunk deep into morality. The Zohar says, if he knew this, why was he not afraid for his wife? Why did he not turn back and say, we will find food wherever it may be, but we're not going to go to this country, Egypt, and refuse to enter? So Rabbi Yesa in the Zohar says that begin the Chama Shchita Ima. He saw that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, was accompanying her. He saw something about his wife that understood that she is protected. If she is protected, then I know that we're meant to go to Egypt. Even though it should be our last resort, I know that if God arranged a famine and is forcing us to go to Egypt, and now I also see that God is watching over her, which is my only fear, then I can naturally prevent them from killing me by saying that I'm not her husband, but rather her brother. But we're still stumped by that couple of words that says, so that it should be good for me that I'll leave with presents. That's the only thing. But the fact that Avram was certain that she would be safe and that God, for some reason, is directing them towards Canaan, that I can appreciate is somehow part of the story. But I do have to also recognize that there are many stories about Avram and Sarai that the Torah does not share with us. The biggest proof, I said this in many classes, our first introduction, outside the fact that there is such a person called Avram, and that he has a father called Terah, and that he married a lady called Sarai, and that she didn't have children. Outside of those few details at the end of the portion of Parashat Noach, the first time that we're introduced to Avram again in the next Parashat, that God is appearing to him, Avram is 75 years old. So we know that there are many stories in Avram and Sarah's life and in Avram's life before marriage that are not being recorded in the Torah. So we have to assume that when the Torah is picking to record a particular story and provide this as our tradition that we're meant to pass on from generation to generation, means that we have to understand the story, we have to explain Abraham's actions, that they're a lesson to us, and that we need to emulate that behavior. So it certainly can't be understood that Avram was simply trying to benefit off the risk to his wife, because we would not be emulating such behavior. So the only way to understand this is, one, that Avram was certain that she would not be harmed. And beyond that, tell me what else was going on behind that story that you needed, that things should be good for you because of it. We know that Avram and Sarah, throughout their lives, they are the prototype Jew. So everything that they're doing, they're taking the first steps on this cosmic journey of the entire Jewish people. So when they headed to Egypt, they knew that God had a mission for them, that a mission was waiting for them. In fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe writes that the journey and the end result of their journey to Egypt, you will notice a pattern that gets repeated over and over again throughout Jewish history. If I had to sum it up, you end up going to a place that's immoral, questionable. You engage with it, and you leave with great wealth. If I had to ask you, tell me one story after Avram and Sarah. So Avram and Sarah end up going to Egypt in an immoral place. They engage in it. Oh man, with no less a person than the king of Egypt, with abducting Sarah, him getting her back eventually, and then leaving with great wealth. If I had to ask you, tell me what other story reminds you of that, you wouldn't have to go very far in history. You'd say the story of the Jewish people in Egypt. They go to Egypt. It turns out to be an immoral place. They get abused. They engage. And they leave with great wealth. What Avram and Sarah were doing with this first journey of theirs, they were pioneering a Jewish approach to God and our mission here in this world. They were saying, instead of staying in Israel, I think God is telling us that we cannot take a defensive posture if we want to remain Jews. This journey is a necessary step in our godly mission, not only to believe and trust that God is protecting us, but we have a specific purpose to accomplish, and that journey, as I mentioned, from Avram and Sarah would repeat itself, and we could be successful if we learn from Abraham and Sarah's journey. It will give us the corporal framework to understand the purpose of our exile. It will give us the clarity that exile is not meant to prevent us from achieving our purpose, but rather we need to be able to engage and use the good aspects of the world for our purpose in fulfilling God's mission. So, where do we start? We go back to the Zohar. The Zohar tells us that Abraham and Sarai, they say it in simple words, which I'll tell you in a moment, but basically Abraham and Sarah embody two representations of two psychological and spiritual elements required to fulfill our mission. Sarah, the Zohar says, is guf, body. Abraham, neshama, soul. That's what the Zohar believes. Sarah, body, Abraham, soul. What does that even mean? So the soul, if you had to talk about the soul approach to life, you'd have to know about the soul. And we could safely say that the soul left to its own devices is primarily concerned with only one thing: its connection to God. It is happy to remove itself from every worldly element that's a distraction to fulfilling its mission. That's why the soul loves it up in heaven, in paradise. There's no distractions. It's constantly being connected to its core. Why would the soul? And that's why the Mishnah says, Al korcha chatachai, against your will you live. Because why does the soul want to come into this world? Why would the soul want to descend into Egypt, where it can easily lose sight or be forced to lose sight between right and wrong? That's the soul approach. What's the body approach? The body approach is that I'm prepared to meet a successful body approach. I'm prepared to meet the world where it is, nurture the good that the world has, and bringing all the elements that the world could benefit from the contributions that my godly soul can provide for it. When Abraham and Sarai came to Egypt, what the Zohar is saying is that they came as a marriage of body and soul. The soul was going to help navigate the body through the turmoil of Egypt. In the words of the Rebbe, he says, in our divine service of Torah and mitzvot, and exposing holiness in this world, there are two general approaches. The service is primarily performed by the soul. It's only that the soul uses the body for its purposes. The neshama wants to give tzedakah, it uses the hand to put the coins in the pushka. The soul wants this, it uses the body to fulfill its expression. And then there's another form of service, which we're going to elaborate on, but let's start off with the words of the Rebbe. The service is performed by the body and with the body. These people do not remove themselves and remain aloof from the world. On the contrary, they descend from their perch, invest themselves into practical matters of this harsh world where evil reigns supreme. And it is there they fulfill Torah mitzvahs and elevate the holy sparks found there. In the first approach, it is the soul that calls the shots. It wants to engage in prayer and Torah learning. It shelters itself from immorality. But the body, no. When the body is directed properly by its godly soul, it's not afraid of the world. It goes out in the world. It wants to incorporate godliness and godly values into its mundane life. Typically, somebody who's got his head on right and the body's being influenced by the soul, typically it will be translated in activism. I met someone yesterday, actually, who has a tremendous business. He told me that he wants, I didn't get the part of the story really, actually, what turned him, but he ended up saying that I felt that I have to use the tools of my business to start promoting the availability of Jewish education to people. And he put up like just ads in the internet. And he's getting hundreds of hits of parents that said under the right conditions, we would consider switching our kids from public school into a private Jewish day school. Activism. He took his engagement and his involvement in the business world, and all of a sudden his soul somehow ignited his body to say, okay, in the very world that you're in, engage and uncover the holy sparks. See, the soul really has no need for the body. It's busy just keeping the body free from sin. But the body needs the constant encouragement of the soul to give it clarity and direction. That's the difference between the body working in this world and the soul. Now, for a moment, I want to deviate and talk about something from the Alter Rebbe. First Chabad Rebbe, that in the book of Tanya, he talks about two types of love. An example for these two types of love could be brother, sister, and spousal. Brother and sister, Hasidic philosophy would explain, is a very natural love. In fact, it exists from birth, obviously nurtured as two people are being brought up in the same house, but it's a love that feels very natural. You don't have to work on it. In fact, on the contrary, nothing could be done. You still feel a connection between brother and sister, brother and brother, sister and sister. There's a second category of love, which we would compare to a spousal relationship, husband and wife. It's not something that comes natural. It's far less stable at times. But the unnaturalness and the instability at times is capable of producing a far more passionate attachment. So let me explain to you why. Also, in the words of the Rebbe, the love of a brother and sister is a natural phenomenon. There's no yearning and ecstasy of the soul. But you know what? There cannot be a complete unity because they're really two separate people. Different interests, different attachments. But what happened? What about a spousal relationship, husband and wife? This is the relationship between body and soul. Chassidus uses the analogy of husband and wife. Although it's possible that a spousal relationship can end, and why can it end? Because it's not due to the nature of their birth. You can never end a relationship between brother and sister. You cannot talk, but you can't end that relationship. A spousal relationship can end. Why? Because they're not one. But precisely between them, there can be passion and ecstasy of the soul. And the unity that can be accomplished, that can exist in their relationship, is a total unity that can evolve into them becoming literally one person. You see, the natural closeness of siblings is actually what prevents them from getting any closer. The relationship has already been established from the get-go. It is what it is. Throughout their life, they could simply reflect a relationship. It could simply reflect the relationship that they have naturally. The more they talk, the more they'll seem like brother and sister. The more they'll understand that they're actually brother and sister from the get-go. But that's as close as you will ever be. as close as you will ever be is the brother and sister relationship that you have from the get-go. And by the way, there's something about our relationship to God that reflects that relationship. We call it that pintele yid. You know, we always say, no matter how far a Jew can run from God or assimilate, God forbid, or ignore God, at the end of the day, you're brother and sister with God. At the end of the day, when the stuff hits the fan, and there are no atheists in foxholes, at the end of the day, your neshama has a relationship with God. There's no doubt about that. But there's another relationship that we have with God, a body relationship, one that has no natural inclination like the pintele yid, like the core of a neshama that has a natural inclination to God if it just simply wasn't being held back or distracted. But then we have a relationship that's not natural. But when it evolves and is developed, like a husband and wife, when we do decide to fall in love with God, that's a far more passionate and energetic connection than we can ever have naturally. So how do you develop a body relationship with God? Which, if left to its own devices, will actually be naturally inclined to fulfill its own passion, desires. It's egotistical, it's egocentric. It wants what it wants. Well, even the body understands something that's beneficial. See, as much as you like cake, the body could say, I'm not going to have dessert. Because at this moment, as much as I like cake, I want to be a little skinnier. The body could be less egocentric if it feels it's gaining other benefits. In the same way, the body can actually also appreciate a relationship with God if from the get-go it thinks it might be beneficial to it. It may not be the way that it ends up, but it may be the way it starts. So what would a body start to do if it thought it would be beneficial to have a relationship with God? It would start building moral character. It would start reinforcing positive thought patterns. It would reinforce positive behaviors. So, in the eyes of Chassidus, we were never desirous to squash the body's desires. It was simply to redirect the energy and the yearning that comes naturally to you. That's very apparent. You don't have to look for it. That's all about body. You don't need a lot of deciphering. And channel it towards godly pursuits. See, in the words of Chassidus, I'm going to read now from each holy spark did not descend into this world for its own betterment, because it's a vast descent, a state of actual exile. Because even a perfect holy person serving God with awe and love never touches the quality of attachment to God with love and awe that the soul experienced prior to its descent into this world. You can't compare. It had everything. What does it need to come down here for? The world's love is not even a fraction of the prior love that the soul had in heaven. There can be no comparison between them all, for the body cannot contain it. So the question is, why does it come down into a body? Rather, the reason the soul descends into this world, integrates within a body, and natural soul is only to fix them. The goal is to isolate them from negativity of evil by keeping the 365 prohibitions, to elevate the natural soul together with those parts of the world it's attached to, by fulfilling the 200 godliness is drawn down, by fulfilling the 248 positive commandments, by the agency of the vital soul, for is the one performing all the practical mitzvah. The entire reason that the neshama comes into this world is to have a positive impact on the body, so that the body has the wherewithal to develop a relationship with God that even the godly soul cannot have. A passionate one. It has a natural one, but not a passionate one. And this is the lesson that we see from Abraham. When the Torah tells us, according to the Zohar, that Abraham told Sarah, you know what? Tell them you're my sister so that I will acquire wealth. What the Zohar was saying is that Abraham was telling his wife the embodiment of the body experience. He was telling his wife, I'm the embodiment of the soul experience. I understand that the ultimate and most complete elevation for my soul can only happen by sending the body to the lowest depths of this world, engaging with it, even to the level of the house of Pharaoh, and coming out successful. It wasn't the physical wealth only. The physical wealth represented Abraham, the soul, being successful in a joint effort between body and soul to engage in world, remain unscathed, and elevate the sparks of holiness that were embedded in a bad place. So while it's true that Abraham knew prophetically that nothing would happen to Sarah, he saw the divine presence accompanying her. He was also saying something else. That Sarah's embodiment of the body approach to attachment to God, and he knew that nothing bad would happen to Sarah. He knew that Sarah's approach of engagement in the world, the person she was, there was nothing to fear. She would not be influenced one iota by what was happening around her. She would always retain a moral clarity to make sure that everything would end up just right. In the words of the Rebbe, no negative forces were able to harm her. In that sense, we are guaranteed that the soul will not suffer any personal setbacks when it comes into this world. What's more, the body too will suffer no spiritual harm. It will not sink if we do the right thing, God forbid, into evil. Instead, the opposite will happen. They will both rise even higher. And that's the reason why the soul journeys into this world, for a subsequent elevation achieved through refining the body. Not only does the body able to accomplish an attachment to God that's far more exciting and passionate than the love, the natural love that the soul has for God, by accomplishing the overcoming of the world obstacles and distractions. But once it does accomplish that, it's able to provide an elevation to the soul also. So the soul comes down into this world for two reasons: to help the body navigate, and then at the end of the journey, it also receives a benefit from the success of the body connection to God's service. So it tells us two things. The spousal relationship is a perfect analogy because it tells us that sometimes when you could create a relationship where no relationship ever existed, or in fact, naturally, there is a distance and difficulty in obtaining such a relationship. Many people say a husband and wife is the most unnatural thing to happen. Two people being raised in two different homes with two different mishigasim, and now we're expected to live together for the rest of our lives. Doesn't make any sense. But if you could succeed at it, it has something that comes naturally doesn't have. And this tells us a very important point. You see, everybody thinks that having a relationship with God should seem natural. And that's not true. That works for your neshama, but not for us here. Anything that's not natural and you succeed at, that's exciting. People who learn people who know that I'm not let's say I succeed at, I don't know, at music, but I have a natural talent for music. But there's something exciting if somebody says, I naturally don't have balance, but he successfully learns how to surf. It's an excitement to that. Because at that point, you've done something that wouldn't come natural to you. And God doesn't want our connection to him to be boring. He wants it to be exciting. He wants us to take that which is unnatural and transform it for a home where he can feel comfortable. So if I want to end off with a line, I would say, God didn't send us to this world because he wants a brother or a sister. He wants a spouse. He wants one that every day the relationship is a little uncertain. And at the end of the day, he says, wow, this is really working out well for us.